Thank you everybody for coming today to talk with Dr. Jack Naglieri about intelligence testing, particularly his theory of testing and a framework for determining specific learning disability.
Suzanne, thank you so much for making this happen. Today I will talk about SLD eligibility, using a pattern of strengths and weaknesses, and specifically my discrepancy consistency method. Please note on this first page that my email and my website are listed. I do that to make it easy for people to find me. My website is growing. We added a whole bunch of webinars and other web presentations I've given lately. So I encourage you to go on my website. You can download all kinds of information, like the 10-minute solutions, for example, has a short article that Steve Pfeiffer and I have written on dyslexia explicitly in California. We have other articles in there about using the PSW method in general, and so on. Case studies, as I mentioned, a lot of videos, and articles that are harder to get sometimes, like it's a book chapter, and you can just download it right off my website. I think it's really important to provide a lot of resources for people. You can't buy anything on my website. Everything is free there, without exception, including my past score analyzers that I'll show you in a few minutes. Of course, it's always important for me just to remind you that I might be mentioning these various tools as we go through today. And, you know, as the author, it's always important that you know that. Okay, now, I like to start with conclusions. Because I think when you have a sense of the big picture, so if you know my past theory, simultaneous processing is about getting the big picture, right? So now I'm teaching you using that theory as a basis. And the concept is, what's the big picture here? We're going to fill in all the details and the research and the logic, but what's the big picture? So here's the first thing. I learned a long time ago that when we as school psychologists do a comprehensive evaluation or work with a student, we're likely going to change that student's life. Not just what happens in school, but really the impact of what happens in school going forward is really profound. And to me, that means what we do is really critically important. And that also means we have to really, really deeply understand exactly what we're doing and really understand the tools that we use. Of course, as a test developer, that means something really important to me, because I have to be able to communicate that to you about at least my tools. So when we think about like intellectual assessment, what do we really want from that? Well, we want to be able to sit in the witness stand when the attorneys ask you, and why did you determine that this child had a specific learning disability? And you simply say, well, IDEA defines a learning disability as a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes, and I use the test explicitly designed to measure basic psychological processes, and I used it in accordance with the procedures established by the author for determining when a student's score is sufficiently low and sufficiently comparable and different than other pieces of data to arrive at my conclusion. So when you go in with that kind of a perspective, it's pretty straightforward, because you'll be able to really demonstrate strengths and weaknesses, and not only make good eligibility determination, but also be able to say a lot about what the teacher, the parent, and the student can do to leverage the strengths to manage whatever needs. We're really talking about a strength-based approach here. And we are talking about the most fair assessment of ability that there is. And I'll show you the evidence for that. So I like to think of the CAS as a second generation of measures of ability. Now, you can call it ability, you can call it intelligence, you can call it cognitive processing, you can call it a lot of different terms. To me, it doesn't really matter. What really matters is what that conceptualization is built on and how is it achieved. And I'm going to be stressing today that what we need to do is measure thinking in a way that's not confounded by knowing. And that thinking should be defined on the basis of brain function, not because we had certain subtests in the WISC that we decide that's what intelligence is. That doesn't make sense to me. So really, past theory is a way of defining thinking. Thinking is another term for basic cognitive processes, basic psychological processes. The CAS-2 is a way of measuring a student's ability to think. That's the big picture for today, and we're going to move right along. So this is the basic outline. We're going to talk about the theory based on brain function. We'll see how we go from PASS to the cognitive assessment system. We'll look at some profiles. We'll look at some research. We'll talk more explicitly about eligibility determination. And we'll just end with some, I think, kind of summary statements about validity and why the tool matters. But let me give you a little bit of background. Sometimes people ask me, how did you get interested in learning? You know, you do all this work on intelligence, but learning is like educational area. And I said, well, in my first profession as a musician, I was teaching guitar when I was 17. This is my first band that I ever had. And Charlie and Bobby, you know, this is in the early 70s. So anyway, when I was teaching, I noticed that not all my students benefited the same way, even though I used the same books and the same lessons and everything. And it really got me interested in people and how people learn. When I went to undergraduate, I took all the psychology courses you could take, by the way, except for one course. I didn't take tests and measurements course. I don't know why I didn't do that. Anyway, I was really interested in learning. And then I wound up in a school psychology program. And then I started working as a school psychologist. I actually worked at this school, Charles Champagne Elementary in Bethpage, New York on Long Island. And when I was there, I remember thinking, well, I'm doing what I was taught to do, give a WISC, give an achievement test and all that. But I remember thinking, gee, the questions on the achievement test are just like the questions on the WISC. And I didn't realize at the time that that would be like one of the hallmarks of the work I would do for decades thereafter. Because I noticed things that you all have noticed too. But we accept the content of tests because of their stature in the field. And I'm going to suggest to you that that's not a good reason to accept the content of tests. It doesn't make sense that we should decide how smart somebody is based upon how much they know. Now, why do we have this problem? Because of these guys, these old guys. Thorndike, Otis of Otis Lennon, you know, basically a group administered WISC, and Woodworth and all. These are the people who got together in the early 1900s and created what became the WISC. They created it in 1917, more than 100 years ago. That's where the verbal tests, using math to decide how smart somebody is, and the so-called nonverbal tests were determined to be appropriate for the US military. And if you've ever heard of the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, that's what I'm talking about here. You can actually read those books on Google Books. You can get a PDF of them for free, and you'll see all the tests, subtests that we still have today. But basically what we had was Army Alpha and Beta. The Alpha was things like number series and arithmetic problems and analogies and vocabulary and general information. Think about that. Does that make sense? General information is how smarts are. And then the beta were the nonverbal kinds of things. So we had a lot of knowledge and a little bit of thinking. And if you look at the kinds of subtests on the major tests today, they all are so intertwined with knowledge. This is a fundamental problem. Now, we have the nonverbal tests. And I think it's important to reflect a little bit on why did Yoakum and Yerkes and Otis, why did they have those nonverbal tests? Because they recognized that when they gave the alpha tests, men who fail in alpha are sent to beta, the nonverbal, in order that injustice by reason of unfamiliarity with English may be avoided. That's really clear. It's on page 19 of their book. How come we were never taught this? I was never taught this. I only learned about this by digging deeper and deeper. And here's the thing. There's no mention of measuring verbal and nonverbal intelligences. Everybody believes that's the case. But instead, from the very beginning, the people who developed the tools that became the ones that we have today saw having test questions that required knowledge to be a social justice issue. And today, more than ever, with Black Lives Matter and our increased awareness of the unfairness in our society in so many ways, I think this is even more urgent than it ever has been. We as school psychologists have to stop figuring out, or I should say trying to figure out how smart somebody is based upon how many words they can solve in a vocabulary test and other tests like that. It's not right. And so I want to play this little video because I think Neil deGrasse Tyson's really nails what we're doing right at this very moment. Listen to what he says.
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong.
Isn't that quite a statement? Knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, which is reasonable, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong. That's, I think, a profound statement. That's what I'm trying to help you with today. I mean, I've been digging and digging and digging for decades to really understand the history and the implications and the impact. And that's what I'll be sharing with you today. Second generation, I'm going to start with a case. This is a case that was done by my friend and colleague, Tulio Otero. I'll show you cases with pictures. Of course, the pictures are never the real person, right? But just to be clear, Alejandro, real boy, however, a real boy with academic problems. And of course, usually with academic problems come behavioral problems. Maybe he has ADHD because he's not paying attention, emotional reaction to failure, all that kind of stuff. When Tulio gave the achievement test, he found scores, in the 70s, peaking up in like the mid 80s. And then when he gave the whisk, he found pretty much the same thing. So Tulio showed me this case and we talked about it. And I said, Tulio, this really makes me think this young man's doing the best he can. And Tulio, reminded me about how they agonized over, was he really intellectually, so low that he should be in that kind of a class, or what should he do, blah, blah, blah. But then Tulio gave him the CAS. And here's what he found. So Alejandro has 102 standard score in planning, a 96 in simultaneous, an 84 in successive. So now we're getting, kind of low, but a 67 on attention. Look at the different view of the same child because the tool changed. We went from a first to a second generation test. And now we say, wait a second. this boy has strengths, but we didn't detect them with David Wechsler's test. But we see them now, and that changes everything. Because I've done this with children, other children like this. When you help them know that they're good at figuring out, they're good at seeing how things go together. They're a little low and struggle a little bit with sequencing, but it's really hard to pay attention. And they say to you, yes, that's right, I just can't concentrate. And then you say, but you know what? I know how to help you. And we go from there. I'll talk more about that. But this is life-changing. This is why that very first slide I told you. We change kids' lives, but the tool that you use is going to limit you or help you. And I've seen it case after case after case. With Alejandro, he really, it's not slow learner doesn't really apply to him. He actually has a specific learning disability and he has inattentive type of ADHD. But here's the model, the Discrepancy Consistency Method that we talk about. So at the top are his strengths. Why don't we spend enough time on strengths? We need to. And with past theory, we always are talking about strengths at the top of the triangle. Weaknesses, yes. There's your disorder in processing. And then academic weaknesses on the left-hand side of the triangle. But you know, the really important piece is the consistency. It's not a coincidence that the child who has certain kind of academics has a certain kind of cognitive processing disorder. And with Alejandro, you know, low in attention and successive processing and these academics, but he had strengths. So we used those strengths to help him, to give him hope for the future. You can do better, but it's going to require effort and understanding. And you give him the understanding and he'll have more effort. That's what this is all about. But really, what you see what I'm doing now, right? It's not just about cognition. Talking about changing the mindset of the student, but changing the social emotional perspective of who I am as a learner. It's all interwoven. So this is actually an intervention protocol that I've developed with my colleague, Kathleen Kryza. Look at some of our videos on my website, the ones I've done with Kathleen Kryza. But here's the basic approach that we take. What's the first step after you've done an evaluation of the student and you got their pass scores? Tell the student. Why don't we tell the students what we found? They're the most important person in this whole equation. Because once we help them, that'll influence their motivation, persistence. We'll help them how to use strategies, and they'll be more self-sufficient. And the way that we do that is we give him handouts like so this is the book that I published on intervention handouts built on PASS that you are allowed to copy and give to parents, teachers, students, everybody, so that everybody understands what to do next. So we say, you know, the test showed your brain is strong and seeing the big picture. That's great. And recognizing sequences, well, okay, that's, you know, that's a little bit rough for you, but we'll work on that. We're going to teach you about chunking and putting things in groups, you know? And this is really what we're going to do as we go through today. We can do better. That's the goal. We can do better. Okay, let's take a few more steps. So I want to clarify a few things about past theory. Where did it come from? I first started working with this theory actually in the late 70s when I developed with the Kaufmans a lot of their KBC. And we read J.P. Das, who's pictured here with me, his book on simultaneous and successive cognitive processes published in 1979. Some years later, JP and I met. This is our first meeting. We met in Tucson, Arizona to begin to talk about how we would take a different approach to measuring intelligence or cognitive, and it would be based on the brain and cognitive processing. So we said, look, we know what the WISC measures. We know what IQ is. We're not going to be influenced by that. We're not going to be constrained by that. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to start from scratch, and we're going to build a test based upon brain function. But where do we get information about brain function? We go to the literature, the neuropsychological literature, and we published in 1997 the first edition of the CAS. And then we published the second edition. And as you can see, we both got a little bit older. But JP is actually 19 years older than me, still going strong, still smart as ever. And we both are still, we're not giving up this mission because we think it really makes a difference in kids' lives. So what did we do? We built our test on a conceptualization of brain function that Luria described as 3 functional units. The first functional unit is for cortical arousal and attention. That's in the base of your brain. The second functional unit has two components: simultaneous processing for the back part of your brain. I've already talked about that. And successive processing, the temporal part of the brain. So you got brainstem, occipital-parietal, temporal, third functional unit, prefrontal, frontal lobes. So here's my theory of intelligence, whatever you want to call it. Here's my theory of learning. I really think PASS is a theory of learning. Actually, that's my favorite way of describing it. But here's the definitions of the 4 components. Planning is thinking about how you do, now listen to this part, what you decide to do. How you do what you decide to do. Attention is being alert and resisting distractions. Simultaneous processing is about getting the big picture, seeing how things go together. And successive processing is about following a sequence. Well, look what I just did. I described a sophisticated brain-based theory in the most ordinary terms. I don't need to use psychobabble or all kinds of weird, ways of describing this stuff. Because ultimately, we want to be able to explain it to, we explain it to our 8-year-old granddaughter when she was 7, we talked about it. I've seen my colleague Kathleen Kryza talk to kindergarten kids about their brains, talk about these things. So if you really want to help people who need some help, isn't the first step being able to really explain something to them? And I think it is. So the second thing that we decided when we built the CAS was we needed to measure how well the student thinks in a way that is not confounded by what they know. So how do you figure this out? It's really kind of simple. Let's say you're giving an arithmetic subtest, on a WISC or on a Stanford Binet or whatever, and the child didn't do very well. You can ask yourself these 2 questions. What did the student need to know to complete the task? Maybe it involved, addition of 2 two-digit numbers, and then you have to find out, has the child been taught that yet or not? And how does the student have to think to complete the task? Well, maybe the child needs to use a plan, or maybe the child needs to follow a sequence, and so on. So these are critical questions. If you answer the question, what does the student need to know to complete this task on an IQ test, and you say they have to know this, they have to know that, they have to know the other thing, then in my opinion, it's not an ability test. It's too confounded by knowledge. So let's talk a little bit about the P in planning, in the PASS theory. It's a term used to describe I like to call them neurocognitive functions. Because when we built the CAS, we really were merging cognitive psychology and neuropsychology. And these are similar. Planning is a similar concept to executive function, metacognition, those kinds of terms that you've worked with, we've dealt with for a long time. Frontal lobe, you know the story of Phineas Gage and all that jazz. So, but when we think about planning, what we're really talking about is when you have a goal, you make decisions about how you're going to achieve that goal. And you're really, in that case, predicting what's going to happen if you do something in one way or another, or what someone else might be doing. So it certainly involves impulse control, strategy. Sometimes it means I need more information to answer the question. So that's also a good plan. So this is the part that really helps us solve any kind of a problem. It's not just academics. We focus on academics, but it's not just that. It's social, emotional. It's work, life work. It's really everything. So how do you measure planning? Well, you give a student a relatively easy task, and you let them know that they can fill it out in any way that they want, as long as they follow the basic rules. So in this example, obviously you can figure out what the child has to do. Put XO under the A's and OO under the B's, and so on. And when we give them the blank page without any of the red marks on it, when I gave this to Jack Jr. at age 5, as I introduced the task and gave him the directions, the last part of direction says you can do it any way you want. Jack Jr. did the XOs for A's, then he did the OOs for the B's, and then he started the C column. Well, that's pretty clear. He looked at the task. He decided to do it in a way you could say it's easier. I would say it's more efficient. And he executed his plan and did really well. That's how you measure planning. You give kids a relatively easy task, and you kind of sit back and you say to them, you can figure out how to do it. So one of the things that we have with the CAS 2 is a rating scale for teachers. And the planning items on the rating scale have to do with things like, does the child evaluate his own actions? That's self-reflection, right? Does produce several ways of solving a problem? That's coming up with different strategies to different solutions. So just to see, this is kind of things we see in the classroom. But here's another thing that we might see in a classroom when we teach students about a doubles and near doubles rule in mathematics. This is a way of helping students arriving at an answer by thinking rather than by memorizing. Because when you say to the kid, what's 8 and 8, they say 16. Usually kids learn the doubles first. But then when you say, what's 8 and 9, they say, I don't know, right? And they say, well, 9 is just one more than 8. And you knew 8 and 8 was 16, so what would 8 and 9 be? Oh, yeah, 8 and 8 and 1, well, that's just 17. So what happens is now we're learning by thinking. We're learning the value of a strategy. And this is really beautiful. This was actually Jack Jr.'s work in elementary school, but the teacher just told him to take it home, fill it out, and bring it in tomorrow. The teacher didn't understand the value of this wonderful illustration. Anyway, that's the planning piece. Now, attention. Basic psychological process that we use to attend and resist. It's not just attending, it's also resisting. So it's focused cognitive activity, resistance to distraction, listening as opposed to just hearing. How can we measure it? The Stroop is a really good way of measuring, because when you look at this word here, you want to say red, but you have to say yellow. So what happens is the conflict is at the point of expression. That's why we call this expressive attention on the CAS 2. And the kind of behaviors that we see in the classroom, getting off task, listening carefully, having a good attention span, those kinds of things. But here's the interesting thing. Actually, this is Jack Jr.'s homework. I was checking it one night after dinner, and I glanced at the first problem and saw that Jack chose option D, and I said, Jack, the answer is A, 6:22. And Jack said to me, no, Dad, it's D, 6:22 p.m., not 6:22 a.m. And I thought, after dinner, too many glasses of Chianti. My attention was off. But here's the thing, you never want to give a test like this to a kid who has an inattentive type of ADHD, because their thinking problem will get in the way of how much you can find out about how much they know. See, these terms of thinking and knowing, they're really powerful and they have a lot of relevance. So this is a case that Tulio showed recently, very recently, of a young boy who has some strengths academically and some weaknesses academically, as you can see, and teacher concerns. And on the WISC for Spanish, he's a bilingual student, and Tulio assessed him in Spanish. You can see the scores there. But look what happened on the CAS. 105 in planning, 91 in simultaneous, 94 in successive, 79 in attention, like Alejandro in a lot of ways. So what did Tulio do? He did a simple intervention. He went to my Helping Children Learn book. He pulled out this little graphic, and he helped the teacher understand the value of teaching Jose that when he was stuck, he needed to look at the details. So they scotch taped this little image to his desk. And the day that we were talking about this, Tulio said, and I just got a message from the teacher today saying that Jose increased in his reading accuracy by 80%. He's reading more words correctly than he has. A simple intervention like that, scotch taping a message, a mantra to a student who had trouble attending to his desk. Wow, it made a difference. That's a really simple intervention. All right, let's talk about successive processing next, sequencing. This is temporal lobe, as I mentioned. Anything in order, anything. Speech articulation, recalling information in order, tying your shoes, remembering combination to your locker, reading to coding, word, letter, sound, correspondence. You know how oftentimes people say, oh, this student has dyslexia. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, they did really poorly on the phonological tests. And so we're going to give them all kinds of phonological training. And I go, the only problem with that logic is phonological is a symptom. Successive processing is the cause. You have to deal with the successive processing weakness. It's not just that they don't know the phonics rules. They can't do the phonics stuff because it's all about sequencing. So we, I think, have been misled in a lot of ways to think, oh, phonological is, the problem with dyslexia. No, it's not. It's just a symptom. And it's really a problem. So how do we measure successive processing? We use word recall, like digits forwards kind of thing. We also do a visual digit span test. And we also do a really awesome syntax test. Because syntax is all about sequencing. So for the little kids, we say a statement like the red, green, the blue with the yellow. And this child has to say it back correctly, completely correctly, to get a pass on it. But for the older kids, we say the same sentence, but then we ask them a question. The red, green, the blue with the yellow, who got greened? And the kids laugh and they think it's really a riot, But what we're really doing is we're getting at the syntax of the statement. That's what we're getting at. Getting at the syntax of the statement. And to answer the question, you have to understand the sequence. So we could have said the girl hit the boy with a stick who got hurt. But once you say that, you can see it as a whole. And that would bring simultaneous processing into it. So you can tell we spent a lot of time developing these tasks, more than 10 years actually. We worked more than 10 years to refine and refine and refine these subtests to make sure they work the way they need to. So the rating scale has things like sound out hard words, remember how to spell, imitate long sequences of sounds, things that teachers might see in the classroom. So when my colleague Kathleen Kryza and I were doing our week-long seminar for the Learning in the Brain last year, there were some folks in the audience who had a case. This was a high school boy whose handwriting was atrocious, as you can see in this picture. And they asked me, well, how would you explain this from PASS? And I said, well, according to Luria, the foundation of handwriting would be successive processing. And they all of a sudden, there was a couple of these teachers, and they said, wait a second, we have here, on our computer, we have his PASS scores. Let's look them up. And I was thinking, oh man, I hope it comes out right, you know? Well, it sure did. Look at this, 90 in planning, 93 simultaneous, 103 attention, 55 on a successive processing scale. This is a young adult. This is a young adult with a learning disability that was never identified. This student, young adult, could have been identified in first grade if they tested him with the right test. They didn't. There's a lot of kids at that alternative high school like that. Young adults with undiagnosed learning disabilities. We know that because we gave the CAS2 brief to everybody. All right, simultaneous, getting the big picture. All right, so this is the whole, understanding how things fit together, seeing things as a whole, as a pattern. That's what simultaneous processing is all about. And this is a great simultaneous processing test. Take a look at this. Which picture shows a boy behind a girl? So what do you have to do? You have to understand this statement. We read it to the student, but it's printed on the bottom of the page if they can read. And we can repeat it. The student needs to choose which picture shows a boy behind a girl, not a girl behind a boy, as in number 2. Right? So it's about interrelationships of, in this case, people. The harder items are things like which picture shows a square to the left of a triangle, below a cross to the right of a blah, blah, blah. You know, it gets really crazy. But, but it's all about interrelationships. And so we asked the teacher, well, does this student like to draw designs? You know, are they good at seeing how things go together, patterns, and good with visual materials, shapes? Those are the kinds of things we see. But now I'm gonna take you a little deeper here. So let's look at something at a different level. The item on the left, we have a matrices item on the CAS. You know, I've published my Naglieri Nonverbal, which, as Suzanne mentioned, you know, is widely used for identification of gifted children. In the CAS, we put that within a simultaneous processing category. But let's look at that item for a second. You don't have to label it a white circle and a blue circle. You don't have to label it or use any words. You can look at it and decide what the answer should be, right? Answer should be, which one? Just put your hand up with how many fingers? Yes, number 1. Now, what kind of thinking is involved there? You have white circle becomes blue in the top, white square becomes blue on the bottom, like this. This is to this, as this is to this. This is to this. So it's this relationship here, right? Once you decide for that relationship, you know that's the answer. So now how about this? Girl is to woman as boy is to, obviously, man. Look at this. Girl is to woman as boy is to man. Same thinking, right? 3 is to 6 is 4 is to 8. Same thinking. Now, is anyone in the audience today a musician and can answer the last one? Does anybody know? C7 is to F as E7 is to A. It's the same kind of thinking if you have the knowledge, right? So you know I've been musician for more than 60 years. So this is more than second nature for me. I don't even think about it. I just play it, right? But if you don't have the knowledge, you can't answer the question. Same thing is true with information similarities, arithmetic vocabulary, the phonological tasks that are in the Woodcock, Johnson, and so on and so forth. That's why I'm so adamant. You cannot measure thinking unless you take the knowledge out of it. What we have with PASS is a common knowledge in plain English that you can explain to the most important person, the student you assess, and the people that work with that student. And if you have the luxury of working with that student, that's even better. So when I developed the CAS-2, I wanted to create different versions of the test that could be used in different contexts. So the rating scale is filled out by teachers. In fact, is actually used by teachers if they want to use it. And as I said, I've been training teachers in PASS theory now for years, and they love it. It changes their whole view on how students learn. And they get the rating scale and they use it. The CAS-2 brief you can use like a K-bit or a RIAS or any of those kind of 20-minute, you need a quick look. A lot of special ed folks are using the 20-minute version to get for instructional purposes, like the boy with the low successive because of his handwriting. You see that kind of a score and you'd say right away, bring the school psych in here, give the full test, and determine that child really has a severe disability that no one's identified before. Let's do the right thing now, right? And then the CAS-2 core is 40 minutes. It's 8 subtests, the first 2 in each of the 4 scales. The CAS-2 full version, 3 in each of the 4 areas, has supplementary scales if that's of interest to you. And of course, we have the CAS-2 Spanish. So I really wanted to build out the different ways of getting measurement of the theory. And we also have online scoring and report writing. So I wrote a report for every possible combination of scores. It was a long report. But it's inexpensive and it's unlimited. Once you get the subscription, you can use it as much as you want. And you can cut and paste and download and customize as you see fit. It takes all the grunt work out of it, so to speak, right? The CAS-2 brief is really cool. I actually have the instructions for administration on the record form. And as I mentioned, the CAS-2 rating scale. Get my CAS-2 Essentials book that Tulio and I wrote. That has so much information in it. Lots and lots of case studies. Big section on intervention. And I'm going to show you a few pieces from that in a few minutes. But let's get a little research update, and then we'll take some more questions. I've been working in this area of test fairness from the beginning because, as I mentioned to you, I noticed when I first started being a school psychologist that something wasn't right with my tests. It wasn't fair for certain kinds of kids. And there's a really funny nuance about test fairness that you need to understand well. Because sometimes people will say, well, we took all the bias out of the test. But there's a difference between psychometric test bias and equitable assessment. And if you read the Standards of Educational and Psychological Testing manual, they make it very clear that if a person has had limited opportunities to learn the content in a test of intelligence, that test may be considered unfair because it penalizes students for not knowing the answers. Now, here's the important part. Even if the data, norming data, do not demonstrate test bias. So when you hear someone say, oh, we analyzed our test and there's no test bias, and they never report mean score differences by group, what they're doing is they're ignoring the equitable assessment part of the standards. And I've heard people do this. I've heard people from prestigious universities doing this. And it really irritates me because it's misleading, and I think it's at least disingenuous. And it hurts kids. No, that's not what I want to do. So here's what I learned from pulling together all the evidence that I could get on all these different tests. And Tulio and I put this in our book. So you see the kind of black-white differences you get on all these tests in the yellow shaded boxes. And you see what you get with the KBC. This progression goes all the way down to the CAS2, the smallest difference between grades groups, CAS2, because we measure more than anyone else measures. So there's more strengths in the total score. And we don't measure what kids don't know, right? We're not penalizing for not knowing, not having a good vocabulary. This is a lot of studies. They're all documented in my book. I think it speaks volumes, but there's even more. Here's a study that I published looking at Hispanic and non-Hispanic children on the past theory. Same small difference as with blacks and whites. And then when Tulio and I gave the CAS2, well, when Tulio gave the CAS in English and Spanish in counterbalanced order, you get the same scores, whether you give it in English or Spanish. We published this paper, and then we replicated it, because, you know, replication is important, got the same results. And the really interesting thing is when you look at, do they have a strength and weakness in PASS, over 90% of the time you get the same answer. And you may not know this, but there's a really interesting court case having to do with gifted kids, where in a district, and actually it was U46 in Chicago, in Elgin, Illinois, in a district that had 42% of the district population was Hispanic, but only 2% of the kids in gifted were Hispanic. Obviously something's wrong, right? Well, to make a long story short, the judge ruled that the district intentionally discriminated and violated the Hispanic children's civil rights because they required everyone to have high verbal and math scores in order to get into gifted. Even though they gave my Naglieri nonverbal, and even if they had a really high score on my nonverbal, the district still wouldn't let them in. I think this has implications for what we do as school psychologists, because we do this all the time. I hear this all the time in gifted. Well, we have to give the WISC in Florida, for example. Well, we screen with a COGAT, which is just a group administered WISC, which is laced with knowledge. And then they have to give a WISC after that. Well, double whammy there. Now, I want to just talk about CHC cross battery for a second. What's it based on? It's based on Cattell and Horn's notions of whatever all those factor analyses told them. I don't know if you know about this, but there's a lot of research now that says you should not ever interpret beyond the total score because all the parts don't have enough specific variance to be interpreted. This is a real problem for those guys. It's a problem for the CHC, it's a problem for the WJ, it's a problem for course battery, because what they're saying is there's not enough power in those scores. I'm not exaggerating. This is not even half of the research studies that have been done. Now, I want you to know, I know these people, right? If I didn't think that they were trustworthy, I wouldn't accept what they found, but I do. They're good, honest people who are trying to help us understand what we have. They've studied the Stanford Binet, the WISC in different languages, the WJ cognitive, you know, the Canadian WISC, the Spanish WISC, the blah, blah. They go on and on and on and on. But you know what's really amazing, for me anyway? They did the same analysis with my cognitive assessment system and didn't get the same results. They found that the part scores, the PASS scores, do have enough variance to be interpreted. I took a risk I gave Gary Canavay, somebody who I've known for decades now, when I had my CAS standardization data, I said to him, Gary, I just want to know what is. Just do what you do and tell me. And I'll accept whatever you find. And he did. And it's not the same. Why isn't it the same? Because all that other stuff is the same Army Alpha in another package, in another way to interpret, 101 ways to interpret block design, 90 ways to interpret coding, a mix and match, a little from this test, a little from that test, put it all together, come up with an answer. Well, that's not what I think we should be doing. We need to leave the past behind. We need to look to brain-based conceptualizations, not based on, what did John Carroll do with all those factor analyses? You just factor analyze what we had already. But, I remember having a conversation with Bob Sternberg a long time ago, Well, you get out of factor analysis what you put into it. Everybody knows that. Well, we got out of factor analysis what we put into it, PASS. What I'm telling you is you can interpret those PASS scores. And notice I keep saying PASS, not subtests. I don't think we should ever do subtest analysis on any test. I've been saying that for decades. I used to teach my students, never do subtest analysis on the WISC or anything else. There's too much evidence that doesn't work. Joe Gluting and Paul McDermott showed that in 1990. Doesn't work. I don't care what anybody says. The evidence is clear. Doesn't work. So what do you do on the CAS? You're not going to do subtest analysis on the CAS. We have a theory. We have 4 important cognitive processes. That's what you do. So now your question to me should be, is there any evidence that PASS profiles matter? Right? That's a good question. I'm going to answer it for you. But how do we answer that question? Well, we go and we say, what's the research, like I did on race differences, right? What is the research? We pull it all together. I've pulled it together in several different places. You can get copies of these articles on my website. And now this is a complicated slide. I'm going to walk you through it together. We'll look at it together. So this is the WISC-5, the WISC-4, the WJ, the KBC, and the CAS. I went to the manuals of these instruments and pulled out the studies that showed the profiles by the scales for children with reading decoding failure. Notice it's not learning disabilities, it's specific learning disability. In this case, a dyslexia, a child with dyslexia, reading decoding failure. So what does the WISC-5 tell us? Not a whole lot. A little bit of low on the working memory if you really think that's working memory. I don't think it is, but notwithstanding, not an issue. The WISC-4, WISC-5, basically the same. What about the WJ? Just a weird profile where kind of everything's 90 and above. So is there a disorder in processing being rendered there? I don't think so, right? What about the KBC? I was really disappointed in the KBC, honestly, because I worked on the first one and I hoped it would work, but it doesn't. And then what about the CAS? Wow, look at that. That's crazy. Kids with reading decoding failure really have temporal lobe problems, which is why they can't do our successive processing. Now, is this enough information? No. We need to have another group and see if we get a different profile. And if you think about the students that we have traditionally struggled with, ADHD versus LD, right? So let's look at kids who have ADHD. What do they look like on these profiles? I did the same thing for those individuals. So students with ADHD, area WISC scores, well, that's not telling you anything. Well, Russ Barkley and Kevin Murphy and George DePaul have been saying that for years. You don't get anything out of a WISC that helps you understand if there's anything cognitively happening with a student with ADHD. And the WJ, it's kind of familiar. The KBC, just kind of flat. But look at the CAS. Now, wait a second. Children with attention deficit are not low in attention? That's right. What are they low in? What we call executive function. Frontal lobes, what I call planning, what Russ Barkley talks about all the time. It's a frontal lobe syndrome, you could call it. I think it's a specific learning disability, actually, because it's a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes. Think about it, right? I mean, it is just as viable a disorder as a low successive processing. Now, I will tell you that inattentive type of children, the attention and the planning scores flip. So attention is lower and planning is higher, but inattentive type. That was a study we have out of from Stefano Tade. And any case, but I want to show you one more. I'm going to superimpose these two sets on each other and just point out a few things. So let's start from the right and go to the left. Look at the CAS. Look at the difference between these profiles for these individuals. Wow, that's really startling. The CAS helps us see the cognitive role that is playing out with children with ADHD and the cognitive explanation for reading decoding failure really beautifully. KBC, not much happening. WJ, wow. If you're doing cross battery so you can get all those CHC factors, I would suggest that the WJ doesn't differentiate these individuals very well at all. I'm still waiting to get evidence from, about how these other tools measure any better. And look at the WISC-4 and the WISC-5. The only thing that seems to happen here with the children with reading disabilities, a little bit low on working memory. So how can we understand that? Well, let's think about the working memory scale as digit span. And so digit span forward, well, that is a lot of dependency on successive processing. Now, digits backwards, we know from the article by Schofield and Ashman in 1986 in the journal Intelligence, measured successive and a little bit of planning, so it's very confounded. And the other subtests in the working memory scale, whatever those might be measuring. So I think that's probably like a little bit of a influence there, but really not enough to really rely on. So yeah, we get distinctive profiles. And there's a lot of profile research. Core profiles for the standardization sample, profiles for children who have reading comprehension problems that are different from children who have reading decoding problems. There's a lot of profile research that's out there. And one of the first ones that I did, I actually showed that if you wound up in special ed before the CAS was published, and we had a group of children who we tested during standardization, those students who wound up in special ed were 4 times as likely to have a weakness in one of the basic psychological processes on the CAS than regular kids. So it was an unselected cohort, meaning they were placed before my test came along. We tested them after they were placed, and then we found out these kids have problems. Now, sometimes we have to back up and say, okay, we looked at profiles, we see the factor analysis stuff. What about some basic validity? Like, what's the most basic evidence of validity that you have? Correlations to achievement. Well, in order to answer that question, I'm kind of working against myself if I compare a WISC to a CAS, because the WISC has knowledge in it, right? So you have criterion contamination. But I did it anyway. And look what we find. CAS, the WISC-5 correlation with the Y at 0.53. But if we take out the verbal comprehension scale and just look at the average of the scales that were remaining, it goes down to 0.47. And we did the same thing with these other tests, but it doesn't really matter. Because ultimately, no matter how you look at it, the CAS always correlates the highest with achievement. So in other words, those profiles that we just saw, the influence of those profiles really shows up in the influence on these correlations. And notice the sample size in that study, 1,600 students, ages 5 to 18, who represent the US population. That's a powerful study. And you know what usually happens, the bigger your sample, the smaller the correlation coefficient, because the error variance goes down. And we really, I mean, we really did we just really did good here when we saw this. But what really got me was this next study that I didn't do. It's published by George Giorgio and his colleagues. They did a meta-analysis on all the studies that looked at the relationship between PASS scores and achievement. And here's what they found. The correlations are significantly stronger than the correlations reported in previous meta-analyses for all other measures of intelligence. Wow. That says a lot. And they concluded if we conceptualize intelligence as cognitive processes that are linked to functional organization of the brain, it leads to significantly higher relations with academic achievement, and the processes have direct implication for instruction and intervention. So eligibility, this is going to come to the RTI question. This is a real boy, not his real picture, of course. Case of Rocky. He actually was in a school district very close to where I live in Northern Virginia. Really a well-off district, a lot of services. First grade, he was behind in reading, math, and writing. So they gave him all kinds of instruction, weekly, 6 months of individual reading instruction, made minimal progress, so they left him back. They had intervention. Second year, and the second time in the same grade, he's still struggling, phonics problems, sight words, blah, 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 right? So after 2 years of special team meetings, we finally tested him. Here's what we found. He had a 72 in planning and a 76 in successive, 102 in simultaneous, and a 98 in attention. This poor kid suffered for 2 years because people were pushing RTI, and it was really, the resistance to testing. They would have found this out if they gave the CAS2 brief. They would have found this out the first month that someone said, "Hey, what's happening with this little guy?" They would have known what's wrong, and they would have been able to proceed accordingly. That's not what happened. And when you have a planning and a successive processing weakness, that's really hard. Because when you get stuck, you can't figure out what to do. You really need help. Now, I just want to tell you, on my website, if you go to Pass Score Analyzers, you can get these little spreadsheets that I wrote. And you just put in the PASS scores in what would be a yellow boxes. And then you put in the achievement scores, whatever achievement test you gave. I recommend the FAR and the FAM and Steve Piper's writing test, but you could, if you gave the KT or any of the other achievement tests, including the batteria, I have the same Excel spreadsheets for all the tests, and it'll build a little triangle for you. And I'll tell you, the triangle is so helpful for teachers and parents to really get a handle on. They really like it. It's a good way of explaining what's going on and helping people understand. So what we recommend for somebody like this is, first, the kid's anxious. We gotta help them use plans to overcoming anxiety. Things like graphic organizers, segmenting, chunking. These are all intervention handouts that we give to teachers, the parents, talk to the student about it, and so on and so forth. But here's the ATI piece that I'm going to answer your question, Heather. So in the early 90s, I decided I was going to start doing intervention research in addition to everything else that I was doing. And I started by using a behavioral methodology of pre-post, where we would look at the relationship between how much improvement children show in mathematics taken directly from their curriculum when we help them be more strategic, and if that helps some children more than others based upon their profile, their PASS profile. So Heather, you go to my website and get the other papers that you can read. I'm just going to show you the last one. Because the results are pretty astounding, but look at the title here. This is children with ADHD and SLD. These are the really hard people to work with, right? They have both problems. And now look at the last line, a randomized control study. If you remember your experimental design, what that means is you can say the treatment caused the result. We can't say that with a baseline intervention study, really, but we can say that here. You have to have that randomized control. So anyway, so what happened? And what did we do? Well, we had this was Jackie Eisman's dissertation. We had experimental group, control group. The method that we used was we created math worksheets based upon the mathematics that they had been taught. So we got their curriculum. We created math worksheets using an Excel program that I wrote that would allow you to create an infinite number of math worksheets that had the same level of difficulty, but the numbers were slightly different. And the method was we would give the kids 10 minutes to complete the math worksheets. There were 4 pages of math. And then we would have something in the middle, and then 10 more minutes to do more math. The something in the middle for the control group was more math instruction. Think about that. Kids got more math instruction. The kids in experimental group got this technique, which I call planning facilitation. What does that mean? That means that the teachers, the regular teachers, we didn't do the study, the regular teachers would discuss with the children in the experimental group what the students were doing. So the teachers facilitated discussions. They asked questions. What was your goal? Where did you start? What strategies did you use? What will you do next time? They never taught strategies. They never said, here are the 5 steps to being a better planner or anything like that. And we recorded what the students said. I mean, in the actual article, we have like a whole page of these kinds of things. But the students said things like, my goal was to do the easy problems. Okay, that's fine, but you're not going to increase that much because I limited the number of easy problems. I do the problems, I know I check my work. Wow, how many times do we want kids to say that, right? That's a good strategy, checking the work. You know, I draw lines to keep the column straight, another good strategy. I did the ones that took the least time. Okay, that's a good way to get more done. They're being thoughtful about what they did. So here's what we found. On the math worksheets, taken directly from their curriculum, the normal instruction kids improved the effect size of 0.6. The students who were encouraged to be more strategic, look at that change. That's pretty dramatic. But we didn't stop there. We also gave Wyatt numerical operations. The normal instruction kids got, well, basically the same. The experimental group got better. Then we did math fluency, same thing. Experimental group got better. And then a year later, in this school, the students are assessed academically every year. So we went back a year later and we pulled the achievement scores, and the experimental group was still significantly better than the control group. A year later, we were never in that school. Now, this particular study was the 5th or 6th study that I've done, sometimes involving reading comprehension. But in every single study, we look at the relationship, who improved based, over this interval of time based upon their past profiles. And what we always found is that the students who were low in planning always improved dramatically more than everybody else. The lines would cross, in other words. In every single of these studies, using math or reading comprehension, we've always looked at profiles. The students who gain the most are the students who are low in planning in every study. So said another way, cognition predicts response to intervention. That's your ATI. Why does it work here and it didn't work elsewhere? Because visual and auditory is not that doesn't work. The modality is not the driver. What the driver is what's behind the modality. But remember all the different modalities I showed you for simultaneous processing, for example. We've thought modality matters. It doesn't. If you look at WISC scores or the definition of the aptitudes have been crude. But our definition of aptitude is PASS, and you've seen at least some of the evidence of how well it works. So that's why we get a different result. We get a different result, and ATI is dead if you're using the old stuff. ATI is very alive if you use PASS. Think about Tulio's case with the student who was low in attention. That was an ATI. The attribute of the student was managed by a really simple intervention. Encourage a student to focus on the details, and it made all the difference. My colleague, JP Das, has done a whole bunch of studies with reading decoding, kids with reading decoding problems. And he's shown the same thing, and I've done all this work with math and reading comprehension. I mean, I'm just like showing you a little bit of a window. But read the papers on my website and be in touch with me. We could talk some more about it. But there's clearly evidence that PASS has relevance to instruction. It's really very clear. Here's just some of the studies on it, done by a whole variety of people. They're all summarized in my Essentials book. And again, you can get all of my studies on my website. So here's kind of the big picture there. I'm going to take a few more questions and then we'll stop. So I think that if you have to defend your position that you found a student who has a specific learning disability, and you have the discrepancy consistency method that I described, and you have all this evidence and everything that I've shown you that you can take with you to a due process hearing and say, look, I use this test for this reason, and here it has profiles. Here it's the most significantly related to achievement, and on and on and on. You're in good shape. You don't need to worry about anything. You have all the evidence there. And you can do it in 20 minutes if you want to be doing it at a tier 1 or 2, or 40 or 60 minutes, depending upon how much you want to get out of it. And it's very interwoven with achievement. And we have tables that help you with all of that. PASS and all the tests from Steve Pfeiffer's. But it just is harder if you're not using Steve's test, but it's still doable. All right, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.